I'm not the first person to say this, but the breakout success of Baldur's Gate 3, which is apparently selling way beyond its initial expectations, feels a lot to me like it's replicating something that happened with Elden Ring last year. And there's actually a lot of similarities that warrant the comparison between Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring, but the one that feels most important to me, and the one that I want to talk about in this video, is the fact that they were both kind of surprise hits. I mean, of course nobody doubted that either Baldur's Gate 3 or Elden Ring would find an audience, because both games were created by developers that have an extremely devoted fan base. But that fan base is also kind of niche and, quote, hardcore, unquote, compared to the AAA market. And the thing that was surprising about Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring alike is that they instantly transcended this kind of niche audience and somehow found their way into a more mainstream appeal. And nobody seems to have really expected that the appeal of these games would be as broad as they turned out to be. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about why no one really expected either of these games to be a massive hit, and then I want to figure out what was wrong with that thinking and why conventional wisdom might not really understand what has broad audience appeal, at least in the realm of AAA video games. So the reason why nobody really expected Baldur's Gate 3 to be a mega hit is pretty much the same reason as why nobody expected Elden Ring to be a mega hit. Both of these games are dense and complex in ways that make them seem inaccessible or niche or hardcore. They absolutely reject the modern Ubisoft or BioWare principle of always simplifying and polishing everything, and they don't cater to this conception of a common gamer who has a low attention span, hates to be frustrated, and needs their handheld at all times. You know, Baldur's Gate 3, like Elden Ring before it, doesn't really do any handholding, and instead, both games opt for a more systems-heavy, complex gameplay that frequently sacrifices polish in the name of giving players creative freedom. And what's more, Baldur's Gate 3 also shares with Elden Ring a kind of funny and somewhat maybe outdated design choice of being really light on tutorialization. It's not quite as extreme as Elden Ring, but it really keeps its cards close to its chest and relies on the player just to experiment with how things work to understand how that they can use the game's systems. And that last point about the way in which Baldur's Gate 3 does not really explain itself very well is actually going to be kind of important to my theory about why it was a hit. And it's also part of my theory about why Elden Ring is a hit. I think the fact that these games are kind of complex to get into and do not have very much tutorialization has a lot to do with why they're actually popular. And I started entertaining this theory as I was actually doing a little bit of research, listening to various podcasts, watching social media, and just collecting people's opinions on Baldur's Gate 3 in the days after its release. And I started paying particular attention to people who were sharing their opinions but aren't themselves really like RPG heads, who don't really play CRPGs, have never played a Larian game, but who find themselves nevertheless getting into and enjoying Baldur's Gate 3. And I noticed that they were commenting on the way in which the game is kind of complicated at first. It can be very overwhelming. And it also doesn't really give you any guidance. It doesn't tell you how to navigate its systems. It just trusts you to figure things out for yourself. And I think under normal circumstances, that might be considered a bad thing. It's the kind of thing you associate with inaccessibility and all those bad buzzwords. But in the content that I've been researching, I noticed that this approach is not presented as a bad thing. And instead, people tend to emphasize how it invites an experience that is defined by experimentation, exploration, and discovery. And this process of experimentation and discovery draws them into the game, and it seems to have this tendency to cause people to form a personal attachment with their experience because they're undergoing this somewhat overwhelming trial by fire, and this is a very memorable burden to assume. And so even for newbies of the RPG tradition that Baldur's Gate fits into, the fact that this game is overwhelming at first, and the fact that people just might not even know how to approach it, that doesn't seem to be hitting players as an oppressive experience. It's more like an opportunity for an adventure of discovery where players are rewarded for pressing on through the challenge and figuring out what this game has to offer, whether that's by realizing that you actually don't have to kill every evil-coded character you talk to, you can join them, or figuring out how to utilize items in creative ways, or how to synergize your party. There's so much that this game just doesn't tell you, but it rewards you every time you go with your gut and try something a little bit new or crazy. And all of this kind of got me to thinking, oh, I guess maybe the very things that make Baldur's Gate 3 seem somewhat niche and inaccessible on its face, maybe not destined for the biggest audience in the world, maybe those very same things are actually a central part of its broad appeal. It may be overwhelming at first, it may be a little bit obscure, especially for newbies, and it may not tutorialize its mechanics very well at all, but all of those factors actually end up enhancing the game's sense of adventure because the game is so good at eliciting and rewarding experimentation. It has this tendency to produce a genuine sense of discovery as you blaze your own trail, and you acquire this sense of ownership over your self-created story about how you manage to figure out how to progress through the game's stories and challenges. And I think that sense of adventure and that sense of ownership over your self-created story, that actually has super broad appeal, and it's part of why Baldur's Gate 3 is such a big hit. But the thing is, in order to produce this sense of adventure, maybe you really do need a game that's complex and maybe a little bit obscure and hard to wrap your head around for the first 5, 10, maybe 20 hours of your playthrough. Because that space of obscurity is the space in which you make your discoveries, and it's the background against which they become so rewarding. And that seems like an important insight to me, because obscurity and complexity, those are qualities that conventional wisdom tells us are associated with games that are inaccessible and niche. And because everybody who pays attention to games knew that Baldur's Gate 3 was going to have those qualities, nobody really expected it to be a huge hit. They just thought it would have a nice solid audience of dedicated CRPG enjoyers. But that expectation was apparently wrong, because actually there might just be many millions of gamers who want to be thrown into the deep end when the gameplay has been calibrated to reward your efforts with all of the emergent surprises and discoveries and unique stories that characterize a game like Baldur's Gate 3. And you know, earlier in this video, I was emphasizing all of the similarities that I see between Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring's design philosophy. And as you might have guessed by now, I kind of speculate that the mass appeal of Elden Ring is actually very similar to the story I'm telling you right now about Baldur's Gate 3. Elden Ring sold 20 million copies and people go freaking crazy for that game, including myself. And I think the game might be as popular as it is for the very same reason that nobody really expected it to be capable of reaching an audience of that size prior to its release. It's hard, it's huge, it's unforgiving, it tutorializes literally nothing, it explains nothing. In short, it has all of the qualities that we associate with inaccessible and niche titles. But none of that hindered its popularity, and as any Elden Ring player knows, that first playthrough is really like nothing else that you can have in games. It's a very unique adventure full of highly personal moments of discovery. And the game's general obscurity plays a big role in producing that sense of adventure, because that's actually how adventures work. You need to start out in this position of having no idea of what's going on as a kind of background against which you can make these surprising discoveries and get some of that insight that will illuminate that obscurity and give you purpose and direction in this strange and imaginative world. So let me just wrap up this video by summarizing the basic point that I wanted to make, which I kind of just realized only the other day as I've been following the release of Baldur's Gate 3 and thoroughly enjoying that game. I have arrived at the theory that Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring are mega hits for the same reason that no one expected them to be mega hits. They're defined by design philosophies that people typically associate with inaccessibility. They're complex, demanding, and they don't explain themselves. But apparently, that just doesn't make them quite as inaccessible as conventional wisdom might have suggested. What I personally want from video games, and what it seems many millions of players like myself want, is a space in which you can experiment, discover, and be rewarded for your creativity, and also to have that authentic spirit of adventure, which is so rare, but which video games are really uniquely positioned to afford. But when it comes to creating a game that produces that authentic spirit of adventure, maybe you really do need a game where there's a lot to learn and very little guidance. Maybe you need a game that's a little bit inaccessible on its face, because that obscurity and complexity and demand is the kind of space that invites and rewards experimentation and discovery. And I'm glad that Baldur's Gate 3 is following on the heels of Elden Ring to kind of confirm that impression for me. And maybe if we're lucky, the success of these games can shift the market a little bit away from the simple and streamlined gameplay experiences that typically dominate this space. But anyways, that's all I've got to say on this subject for now. My name's Chumpy. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. I'd really appreciate it because it helps my channel to grow. And if you want to see some more in-depth discussion of Baldur's Gate 3, you should check out some of the shorts on my channel. I've got a bunch of quick analyses of the combat and gameplay in addition to tons of other content for tons of other games. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next time.